Just who were the Romans? Ask anybody to tell you something about the Romans, right out of the blue, just like that. What will you get? I suggest you'll get something like gladiators, Julius Caesar, chariot races, Christians being torn to pieces in the arena, lunatic emperors. You'll get names like Caligula and Nero. Press them, yes, they do know a bit about legions, about the Roman army. They know that Romans made lots of laws, that they built lots of roads, absolutely dead straight, running in all directions, and all roads led to Rome. They know about aqueducts because they've seen ruins of aqueducts in their summer holiday trips around southern Europe. They know there were lots of slaves doing lots of very unpleasant things. Oh, I suppose top of the list would be Nero. He's the one who leaps out of the subconscious first, isn't he? Now let's apply a little bit of common sense. All those things I mentioned, and which the people you asked mentioned, are in fact true. Yes, there were slaves, and there were aqueducts and laws and roads and Julius Caesar and all the rest of it. But all the time, Rome lasted for over 1,000 years. And the city that succeeded it, that carried on the Roman Empire after Rome had been invaded and sacked, Constantinople, lasted for another 1,000 years. So think for a moment, did muscle-bound heroes really drive their chariots round the Circus Maximus for 1,000 years? Is ancient Rome really nothing more than a great big static tableau, panorama, frankly, cliche? Consider, by way of example, to illustrate this, 1,000 years of English history. Supposing you said to somebody, right, what do you know? What are the big things in English history? And supposing they said, yes, Winston Churchill, the Battle of Britain, and our finest hour. True, again. But you would know from your general knowledge that it's a little bit unbalanced. Well, the same thing you can apply to Rome. So let's go back even further, use a little bit more common sense, and try and come at it from a different angle. Perhaps the biggest thing about Rome is that it was big. It wasn't big, it was absolutely enormous. It was the biggest thing in the then known world. It ran from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. It ran from Spain to the eastern side of the Black Sea, almost into Russia. It was the biggest thing, I repeat, in the known world. Not only that, it ran the known world. And it lasted longer than any other similar empire, except Egypt and possibly China. And even when it had gone, even when it had fallen, it cast the longest shadow over the history that followed it of any other empire except possibly Greece. Some might argue China as well. Hundreds and thousands of historians ever since have tried to convey its history, its achievement, its legacy, its influence, to repeat for 1,000 years. And what am I doing? I'm having a crack at the whole thing in 9 short talks. Well, that's impossible, isn't it? Nevertheless, I'm going to have a go. And however much I fall short, I like to hope that by the time I finished, I will have taken you a little bit further than gladiators and chariots and Julius Caesar. So let's go right back then. When did it start? How did it start? How long ago? Well, the date that comes up regularly is 753 BC, 753 before Christ. That's what the Romans used. That's the date they fastened onto. Why? It's a bit vague and a bit random, I must admit. Well, it is to us. But the Romans had their reasons. In fact, they didn't think about the problem for 200 or 300 years. I think they were too busy trying to survive. And they didn't come into being with a fully fledged empire like some kind of flash of lightning. It took a long time, several hundred years. So it took a long time too to put together some kind of version of how they started. And they needed a story. They wanted something to tell their children. Sit on my knee, dear, and I'll tell you where Rome came from, because nobody knew. Nobody kept a diary in 753, so, oh, by the way, Rome appeared this year. No, of course not. And we all need some kind of story, a myth, if you like. One of the earliest questions a child asks, isn't it, is, where do I come from? Well, people did the same with their family, with their country, with their empire. Nowadays, even with their own planet. We all like to know where we come from. It gives us dignity, it gives us a sense of belonging, it gives us a sense of assurance. We know where we are, we know where we fit, we know where we've come from, and we think we know where we're going. And if you can get a few, what's the word I want, sensations into it, a few good stories, a few famous people, so much the better. We discover posh ancestors in our family tree, we're tickled to death, aren't we? We love a few posh ancestors. If we can't get posh ancestors, we'll settle for notorious ancestors. But somebody noteworthy is very welcome to most people's family tree. The Queen, for example, can claim to be the 36th direct descendant from King Alfred the Great. The 36th direct descendant from Alfred the Great. Now, that's not a myth, that's true. It is well documented and thoroughly well accepted by every historian. It goes right back to the Saxon King Alfred. And at the time of Alfred, there were plenty of Saxons and some writers who were going to take the descent of the Saxon kings back even further, right back, in fact, to the god of the Saxons themselves, to the king of the heavens, Woden. King Alfred, they said, was descended directly from Woden. Sounds a bit outrageous, but that's what people did. Julius Caesar and his family claimed that they were descended from the goddess Venus, or in Greek, Aphrodite. And as late as the 17th century, there was a writer in the reign of Charles II, an academic historian, who wrote a serious, straight-faced, po-faced book to prove that King Charles II was descended from the first man, Adam. So everybody did it. But why 753? Well, when the Romans got to work at last, after 200 or 300 years of being around on working out a history, they had to ransack the local legends to see if there were a good story or 2 or 3 good stories which would do as an origin myth. And naturally, they went through whatever folk stories they could have, whatever folk memories they might be able to put together. And by that time, also living in Italy, where the Romans were quite a lot of Greeks. And where the Greeks went, they took their legends and their stories with them. So Greek legend was ransacked as well as Roman legend to produce some kind of origin story. And according to what they gradually settled for, by about 400 BC, 350 BC, all these attempts at putting together a story had sort of crystallized, congealed, whatever adjective you like, has settled down into a version that most people seem prepared to accept. And of course, the longer it went on, the more they told stories to their grandchildren, and they in turn told them to their grandchildren, the more the stories hardened into something which, within 300 or 400 years, very few people dared to oppose. They might have been a little bit skeptical, but nobody stood up and said it was a load of rubbish. So the version that they finally, if you like, became the authorized version There was a prince of Troy. One of the great facts of ancient Greek history, as you know, was the Trojan War. Everybody knew about that, wooden horse and all that sort of thing. And when Troy was finally broken into through the wooden horse and sacked, there was a young nobleman of Troy called Aeneas, Aeneas, and he managed to escape from the flames and the ruins and the mayhem and the total destruction. With his father, according to the story, carried him on his back out of the city with a few family hangers-on and friends and slaves and all the rest of it. And they went on their travels to get away from the nasty Greeks, and they finished up in the middle of Italy. And having settled down there, with great relief, I should think, they built a city. People usually built cities. In ancient history, cities seem to be built with remarkable ease and facility. And the city Aeneas built was called Alba Longa. Alba, A-L-B-A, Longa, L-O-N-G-A. And after he died, the first king, there were lots of kings that followed him. And one of the kings was called Numitor. Don't worry about it, you'll forget it before long. But Numitor had a wicked brother called Amulius. You might remember Amulius. We always remember the nasty ones, don't we? And Amulius turned his brother off the throne. Poor old Numitor had to be a refugee. But Numitor had a daughter called Rhea Silvia, R-H-E-A, Silvia. And there was a convenient soothsayer on hand to tell everybody who was prepared to listen that Numitor would get his revenge on the wicked Amulius because his daughter, Rhea Silvia, would have a son who would come back and turn the villain Amulius off the throne. Having heard this, Amulius naturally decided to take precautions, and the obvious precaution was to see to it that Rhea Silvia did not have a son. So he locked her up. Job done. Fine. He had scotched the great plan. It's at this stage that the gods come into it. In ancient history, you will find in the legends and the other stories that the gods have a rather annoying trick of taking part in human activity. Some for good reasons, some for very mischievous reasons. And Mars was in the mischievous bracket. And he apparently had cast an eye on Rhea Silvia, languishing in her prison, and had taken something of a fancy to her. Gods had an annoying habit of doing this. Jupiter was notorious. And Mars got himself into the prison, not by picking the lock, but by disguising himself. Gods could do that sort of thing. It was a very useful trick they had up their sleeve. And he disguised himself, believe it or not, as a shower of golden rain. It would be a very imaginative sentry, wouldn't it, who looked at a shower of golden rain and said, "Aha, you're Mars, aren't you? You're not coming in." No, he fooled them all. Got in. Rhea Silvia, understandably, fell for him. It was God. And in due course, she produced not one son, but two twins, whom she christened Romulus and Remus. Excuse me. When Amulius found out about this, as of course he was bound to, he took further precaution. He abducted the two boys from their mother. I think Mars had lost interest by this time. The gods were very fickle too. Put the two boys in some kind of cradle or wicker basket or little coracle, something or other, and turned them loose on the river Tiber, hoping that the current would take them downstream, and either they will be drowned or they'd be taken out to sea, and they'd certainly be drowned there. And Amulius could say, "Well, there you are, that's the forces of nature, nothing to do with me, what a shame." Well, the coracle didn't get down to the sea. It lodged in some marshes somewhere, in some reeds, and what should come along but a she-wolf, who did not have any cubs of her own. Took the babies, suckled them, got them through the first tricky weeks and months of infancy. And then along came another very convenient personality in the shape of a shepherd. And we know his name, at least we were told his name, Faustulus. Faustulus. And Faustulus took the boys and raised them. Somehow or other, you're not supposed to ask too many questions with legends, the boys found out about their parentage and about what had happened. So when they grew up, they came back on an errand of vengeance and took their revenge on Amulius, turned him off the throne, put their grandfather Numitor back on the throne. Mother, Rhea Silvia, presumably was appropriately rescued, and everything was fine. And the two boys decided that they would build cities too. As I said, they had a great habit for building cities. And off they went, each started to build their own. According to the legend, Remus got fed up one afternoon, went over to see how Romulus was getting on. And as far as he could see, wasn't getting on very well. The walls were barely a yard high. And Remus, who must have been a bit of a tease, as twin brothers, all brothers no doubt can be, said to Romulus, don't think much of your wall, don't think much of your city, and to prove it, he jumped over it. He said, well, it won't kick pussy out, will it? And Romulus, who by this time had had a very heavy day, it was hot and he was tired and he was fed up, and this teasing struck him on a nerve. And because it struck him on a nerve, he picked up a spade and struck Remus over the head with it and killed him. So there was no going. Remus out of the way. Romulus, of course, his city was going to be called Rome. And one of the great ifs of history is Remus's city, which presumably would have been called Rheims. Anyway, there was no Rheims, there was no Remus, and Romulus duly became the first king of Rome. Because of the legend, it is assumed that Romulus gave his name to Rome. Rome was called after Romulus. The archaeologists and the academics tell us that, in fact, it was the other way round. Rome grew up by a very much more humdrum, ordinary sort of method, became known as Rome. Numerous people argue about what Rome means, but when they put together the legend about their history, they named their first king after their city. So Rome was not named after Romulus. Romulus was named after Rome. Well, that was the story. At that time, of course, there was no BC and no AD, and Romans traditionally got into the habit of working out their dates according to the foundation of Rome. So the date that they settled on was 753 BC. When they wanted to identify a particular event, then, if it happened, shall we say, in 653 BC, they called it 100 years AUC. I'll explain. 100 years after the founding of the city. AUC comes from Latin. Stand by. It stands for ab urbe condita. Ab, from, urbe, the city. We get our word urban from it. And condita means literally having been founded. So, ab urbe condita means from the city having been founded, or from the foundation of the city. Now then, so far, so good. Before very long, of course, certainly now in modern times, we are swamped with scholars and archaeologists who are going to be thorough wet blankets, dirty, rotten, spoiled sports, and tell us that it's not like that at all. They're going to spoil all the good stories, give us something terribly ordinary and routine and everyday and humdrum, and we're on our way in a different sort of way. For 1,000 years, from 753 BC, Rome is going to run for over 1,000 years, a little bit longer than a chariot race.